Translation is the communication of the meaning of a source language text by means of an equivalent target language text, whereas interpreting undoubtedly antedates writing. Translation began only after the appearance of written literature. There exist partial translations of the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh into Southwest Asian languages of the 2nd millennium BCE. Translators always risk inappropriate spillover of source language idiom and usage into the target language translation. On the other hand, spillovers have imported useful source language calques and loan words that have enriched the target languages. Indeed, translators have helped substantially to shape the languages into which they have translated. Due to the demands of business documentation consequent to the Industrial Revolution that began in the mid-18th century, some translation specialties have become formalized, with dedicated schools and professional associations. Because of the laboriousness of translation, since the 1940s, engineers have sought to automate translation or to mechanically aid the human translator. The rise of the Internet has fostered a worldwide market for translation services and has facilitated language localization. Translation studies systematically study the theory and practice of translation. Etymology. The English word translation derives from the Latin translatia. The modern Romance languages use equivalents of the English term translation that are derived from that same Latin source or from the alternative Latin traduco. The Slavic and Germanic languages likewise use calques of these Latin sources. The ancient Greek term for translation, mu epsilon tau alpha phi rho alpha sigma iota sigma, has supplied English with metaphrase, as contrasted with paraphrase. Metaphrase corresponds, in one of the more recent terminologies, to formal equivalence, and paraphrase to dynamic equivalence. Strictly speaking, the concept of metaphrase, of word-for-word translation, is an imperfect concept, because a given word in a given language often carries more than one meaning, and because a similar given meaning may often be represented in a given language by more than one word. Nevertheless, metaphrase and paraphrase may be useful as ideal concepts that mark the extremes in the spectrum of possible approaches to translation. A secular icon for the art of translation is the Rosetta Stone. This trilingual stela became the translator's key to decryption of Egyptian hieroglyphs by Thomas Young, Jean-François Champollion, and others. In the United States of America, the Rosetta Stone is incorporated into the crest of the Defense Language Institute. Theories. Western theory discussions of the theory and practice of translation reach back into antiquity and show remarkable continuities. The ancient Greeks distinguished between metaphrase and paraphrase. This distinction was adopted by English poet and translator John Dryden, who described translation as the judicious blending of these two modes of phrasing when selecting, in the target language, counterparts, or equivalents, for the expressions used in the source language. When words appear literally graceful, it were an injury to the author that they should be changed. But since what is beautiful in one language is often barbarous, nay sometimes nonsense, in another, it would be unreasonable to limit a translator to the narrow compass of his author's words. 'Tis enough if he choose out some expression which does not vitiate the sense. Dryden cautioned, however, against the license of imitation, i.e., of adapted translation. When a painter copies from the life, he has no privilege to alter features and lineaments. This general formulation of the central concept of translation, equivalence, is as adequate as any that has been proposed since Cicero and Horace, who, in 1st century BCE Rome, famously and literally cautioned against translating, word for word. Despite occasional theoretical diversity, the actual practice of translation has hardly changed since antiquity, except for some extreme metaphrases in the early Christian period and the Middle Ages, and adapters in various periods. Translators have generally shown prudent flexibility in seeking equivalents, literal, where possible, paraphrastic where necessary, for the original meaning and other crucial values, as determined from context. In general, translators have sought to preserve the context itself by reproducing the original order of sememes, and hence word order, when necessary, reinterpreting the actual grammatical structure, for example, by shifting from active to passive voice, or vice versa. The grammatical differences between fixed word order languages and free word order languages have been no impediment in this regard. The particular syntax characteristics of a text source language are adjusted to the syntactic requirements of the target language. When a target language has lacked terms that are found in a source language, translators have borrowed those terms, thereby enriching the target language. Thanks in great measure to the exchange of calques and loan words between languages, and to their importation from other languages, there are few concepts that are untranslatable among the modern European languages. Generally, the greater the contact and exchange that have existed between two languages, or between those languages and a third one, the greater is the ratio of metaphrase to paraphrase that may be used in translating among them. However, due to shifts in ecological niches of words, a common etymology is sometimes misleading as a guide to current meaning in one or the other language. For example, the English actual should not be confused with the cognate French actual, the Polish aktualny, the Swedish aktuell, the Russian or the Dutch aktueel. The translator's role as a bridge for carrying across values between cultures has been discussed at least since Terence, the 2nd century BCE Roman adapter of Greek comedies. The translator's role is, however, by no means a passive, mechanical one, and so has also been compared to that of an artist. The main ground seems to be the concept of parallel creation found in critics such as Cicero. Dryden observed that translation is a type of drawing after life. Comparison of the translator with a musician or actor goes back at least to Samuel Johnson's remark about Alexander Pope playing Homer on a flageolet, while Homer himself used a bassoon. If translation be an art, it is no easy one. In the 13th century, Roger Bacon wrote that if a translation is to be true, the translator must know both languages, as well as the science that he is to translate, and finding that few translators did, he wanted to do away with translation and translators altogether. The translator of the Bible into German, Martin Luther, is credited with being the first European to posit that one translates satisfactorily only toward his own language. L.G. Kelly states that since Johann Gottfried Herder in the 18th century, it has been axiomatic that one translates only toward his own language. Compounding the demands on the translator is the fact that no dictionary or thesaurus can ever be a fully adequate guide in translating. The British historian Alexander Tickler, in his essay on the principles of translation, emphasized that assiduous reading is a more comprehensive guide to a language than a dictionary's. The same point, but also including listening to the spoken language, had earlier, in 1783, been made by the Polish poet and grammarian Onufry Andrzej Kopczynski. The translator's special role in society is described in a posthumous 1803 essay by Poland's La Fontaine, the Roman Catholic primate of Poland, poet, encyclopedist, author of the first Polish novel, and translator from French and Greek, Ignacy Krasicki. Other traditions due to Western colonialism and cultural dominance in recent centuries. Western translation traditions have largely replaced other traditions. The Western traditions draw on both ancient and medieval traditions, and on more recent European innovations. Though earlier approaches to translation are less commonly used today, they retain importance when dealing with their products, as when historians view ancient or medieval records to piece together events which took place in non-Western or pre-Western environments. Also, though heavily influenced by Western traditions and practiced by translators taught in Western-style educational systems, Chinese and related translation traditions retained some theories and philosophies unique to the Chinese tradition. Near East, the traditions of translating material among the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Syriac, Anatolian and Hebrew go back several millennia. An early example of a bilingual document is the 1274 BCE Treaty of Kadesh. Asia. There is a separate tradition of translation in South, Southeast and East Asia, especially connected with the rendering of religious, particularly Buddhist, texts and with the governance of the Chinese Empire. Classical Indian translation is characterized by loose adaptation, rather than the closer translation, more commonly found in Europe. And Chinese translation theory identifies various criteria and limitations in translation. In the East Asian sphere of Chinese cultural influence, more important than translation per se has been the use and reading of Chinese texts, which also had substantial influence on the Japanese, Korean and Vietnamese languages, with substantial borrowings of vocabulary and writing system. Notable is the Japanese kanbin, a system for glossing Chinese texts for Japanese speakers. Though Indianized states in Southeast Asia often translated Sanskrit material into the local languages, the literate elites and scribes more commonly used Sanskrit as their primary language of culture and government. Islamic world translation of material into Arabic expanded after the creation of Arabic script in the 5th century, and gained great importance with the rise of Islam and Islamic empires. Arab translation initially focused primarily on politics, rendering Persian, Greek, even Chinese and Indic diplomatic materials into Arabic. It later focused on translating classical Greek and Persian works, as well as some Chinese and Indian texts, into Arabic for scholarly study at major Islamic learning centers, such as the Al-Qara'an, Al-Azhar, and the Al-Nizamiyya of Baghdad. In terms of theory, Arabic translation drew heavily on earlier Near Eastern traditions as well as more contemporary Greek and Persian traditions. Arabic translation efforts and techniques are important to Western translation traditions due to centuries of close contacts and exchanges. Especially after the Renaissance, Europeans began more intensive study of Arabic and Persian translations of classical works as well as scientific and philosophical works of Arab and Oriental origins. Arabic and, to a lesser degree, Persian became important sources of material and perhaps of techniques for revitalized Western traditions, which in time would overtake the Islamic and Oriental traditions. In the 19th century, after the Middle East Islamic clerics and copyists had conceded defeat in their centuries-old battle to contain the corrupting effects of the printing press, an explosion in publishing ensued. Along with expanding secular education, printing transformed an overwhelmingly illiterate society into a partly literate one. In the past, the sheikhs and the government had exercised a monopoly over knowledge. Now an expanding elite benefited from a stream of information on virtually anything that interested them. Between 1880 and 1908, more than 600 newspapers and periodicals were founded in Egypt alone. The most prominent among them was Al-Muqtatif. It was the popular expression of a translation movement that had begun earlier in the century with military and medical manuals and highlights from the Enlightenment canon. The movement to translate English and European texts transformed the Arabic and Ottoman Turkish languages, and new words, simplified syntax, and directness came to be valued over the previous convolutions. Educated Arabs and Turks in the new professions and the modernized civil service expressed skepticism, writes Christopher de Bellaigue. With a freedom that is rarely witnessed today, no longer was legitimate knowledge defined by texts in the religious schools, interpreted for the most part with stultifying literalness. It had come to include virtually any intellectual production anywhere in the world, one of the neologisms that, in a way, came to characterize the infusion of new ideas via translation was Darwiniya, or Darwinism. One of the most influential liberal Islamic thinkers of the time was Muhammad Abduh, Egypt's senior judicial authority, its chief mufti, at the turn of the 20th century and an admirer of Darwin who in 1903 visited Darwin's exponent, Herbert Spencer, at his home in Brighton. Spencer's view of society as an organism with its own laws of evolution paralleled Abduh's ideas. After World War I, when Britain and France divided up the Middle East's countries, apart from Turkey, between them, pursuant to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in violation of solemn wartime promises of post-war Arab autonomy, there came an immediate reaction. The Muslim Brotherhood emerged in Egypt, the House of Saud took over the Hejaz, and regimes led by army officers came to power in Iran and Turkey. The liberal currents of the modern Middle East, Belayne, Islamism and militarism, received a major impetus from Western empire builders, as often happens in countries undergoing social crisis. The aspirations of the Muslim world's translators and modernizers, such as Muhammad Abduh, largely had to yield to retrograde currents.